There is a moment in a man's life when he realizes that what he always called being different was never a gift in the beginning. It was a negotiation, a quiet survival strategy, a way of becoming a foreigner inside his own home. And the illusion many men carry into adulthood is the idea that this rarity makes them special, when in truth it often makes them tired, because what you learn to call rare may have been nothing more than a blueprint written in an environment that couldn't read you. If you've ever felt like an error in the system, as if your depth was somehow misplaced, you're not alone. Many men who identify with this so-called rare personality are not walking around with a mystical signature. They're carrying the residue of misattunement, hyper-attuned to others because someone in their childhood was unpredictable, emotionally perceptive because they had to detect storms before they arrived, thoughtful because speaking openly would have caused friction. You learn to absorb, interpret, and anticipate long before you learn to name what you actually felt. Imagine a carved relic buried inside a construction site, finely made, intricate, sensitive, and yet constantly in danger of being chipped and repurposed by forces that never recognized what it was. That is how a boy becomes someone the world later calls rare, not through destiny, but through adaptation, through the kind of vigilance that sharpens empathy far too early, through an old soul insight born not from wisdom, but from parentification, through an inward life that grew because the outer world did not know how to meet him. One unconscious mistake many men make is assuming that this complexity was always natural. That being perceptive, inward, and emotionally layered was their intrinsic design. It's soothing to imagine yourself as the exception, rather than the child who had to grow up fast. But when you peel back the stories, what often remains is the simple fact that certain traits became necessary long before they became admirable. The overthinking you call intuition may have begun as a self-defense system. The empathy you pride yourself on may have been a way to keep peace in a volatile room. And the depth others compliment might have formed because there was no space for you to be simple, messy, or ordinary. The cost of this early adaptation follows you into adulthood. It appears as a strange loneliness that persists even when you're socially competent, as a pull toward partners who are chaotic, unavailable, or unpredictable because some part of you still equates volatility with significance, as a capacity for profound care, paired with a subtle ability to manipulate harmony without ever raising your voice, as exhaustion from being everyone's emotional hinge, even when no one asked you to be. Jung would say that when a boy grows up in an environment that demands peace at any cost, he learns to exile his own warrior, his anger, his boundary, his instinct, all pushed underground so he can maintain connection. The seer develops while the warrior sleeps. And yet, every exiled part continues to act in the shadows, not through aggression, but through withdrawal, fantasy, or silent resentment. This is the tension inside the man the world calls rare, a deep interiority paired with an unfinished fire. But here is the quiet truth most people never mention. What looks rare on the outside is often a survival pattern on the inside. Something formed in the gap between who you were and what your environment allowed you to be. And if you've ever wondered why insight doesn't cure your loneliness, or why people feel drawn to you yet never truly reach you, it's because the blueprint wasn't built for connection. It was built for safety. Every few minutes in this exploration, I'll offer a reframing to help loosen the old narrative. And here's the first. You are not rare because you are hard to understand. You are rare because you learn to understand everyone else before understanding yourself. As we continue, we'll trace how this structure forms and how it shapes intimacy, attraction, and identity. We will not romanticize it. We'll look at how this blueprint bends relationships, how it hides anger under patience, and what happens when the mask eventually cracks. And if you stay through the middle of this video, there is one pattern we'll name, one almost invisible reflex that changes how men like this understand their entire relational history. Most never recognize it until they finally hear it spoken aloud. If you want, you can take a breath here. Notice what your body does when you feel seen. This is the beginning of the unraveling, not of who you are, but of who you had to be. There is a point in a man's memory where the story of rarity quietly begins, though he may only understand it years later. It usually starts in a room where someone's mood mattered more than his own. A home where tension could shift in an instant, where the smallest sound or expression changed the emotional weather. And long before he ever thought of himself as perceptive, intuitive, or deep, he learned to scan, not out of talent, but necessity. Not for enlightenment, but for safety. Most men who resonate with this inner landscape don't realize that their earliest form of intelligence was vigilance, not introspection. They weren't born reading micro-expressions. They practiced it because someone in the house became unpredictable, absent, volatile, or emotionally blank. They learned to notice the tightening jaw, the altered breathing, the switch in tone, and they learned it before they learned multiplication. This is how a child becomes the family's early warning system. What looks like empathy in adulthood often begins as fear in childhood. Jung would say that when a child's needs threaten attachment, those needs are exiled into the shadow. Anger, desire, disappointment, anything that could disturb the fragile balance, gets buried. The child becomes outwardly agreeable and inwardly combustible, carrying feelings too dangerous to express. This suppressed fire does not disappear, it condenses. It becomes the reservoir from which adult complexity is later drawn, though it is complexity built from compression, not freedom. The internal script formed here is quiet but powerful. If I stay perfectly attuned, I won't be abandoned or punished. That belief becomes a template, shaping how he speaks, chooses partners, and navigates conflict. It follows him into every room as an invisible contract he never signed, but always honors. As he grows older, another pattern begins to take shape. Feeling other, too intense, too observant, too permeable. He becomes the boy who retreats into inner architecture. Stories, symbols, systems, metaphysics, personality models. Not because he is eccentric, but because the outer world cannot hold what he senses. He becomes fluent in imagination because reality is too abrasive. He builds internal sanctuaries, worlds made of meaning, to survive environments lacking it. And here is a subtle reframing to hold. What he calls depth might have begun as insulation. When a child cannot find emotional resonance outside, he builds it inside. He turns inward, not out of preference, but out of shortage. Over time, this inwardness becomes identity. Shame about being different eventually mutates into covert superiority. A quiet belief forms. I'm not misunderstood. I'm rare. It feels protective, but it is also a shield against grieving the ache of never being met. When social rejection, teasing, or incomprehension arrives, he doesn't crumble. He fortifies. Complexity becomes a fortress. He adds more layers of thought, more meaning, more interpretation. The more he feels unseen, the more he turns inward. The fortress grows taller. And from the outside, people may admire his introspection, never realizing it was born from a hunger to be understood. Meanwhile, on the surface, he appears polished, kind, reliable, conflict-averse. But deep inside, unspoken fantasies take shape. Sometimes he imagines disappearing, becoming invisible, so he no longer has to hold the emotional weight of the room. Other times, he imagines detonating the very system that depends on his compliance. These are not signs of instability, they are signs of imbalance. Jung said that unused force does not vanish. It turns inward and curdles into resentment. And resentment, when moralized, feels like virtue. This boy grows into a man who looks mature, articulate, and stable. But what the world sees as wisdom may actually be emotional suspension. His warrior archetype, the part of him that asserts boundaries, expresses anger, takes action, remains frozen. And frozen force does not stay frozen forever. It leaks, it fractures relationships quietly. It erupts in moments he doesn't understand. For many men, this is where the confusion begins. They can read others instantly, but cannot narrate their own internal state with the same clarity. They feel old even at 20. They fear visibility, yet long for it. They analyze people thoroughly, but pull away the moment someone gets close enough to see them. And the idea of being rare comforts them more than confronting the grief that shaped them. Here is another gentle, destabilizing line. Calling yourself rare can be a way to avoid admitting you were wounded. Yet none of this is a condemnation. It is simply the blueprint that develops when a boy becomes responsible for emotional stability before he develops emotional language. What began as survival becomes personality. And unless examined, personality becomes destiny. Before we step into the next chapter, consider one optional reflection. If part of your childhood involved watching the room more than playing in it, this next section may feel like recognition rather than explanation. Because the vigilant child eventually becomes an adult who appears saintly, patient, understanding, composed. But beneath that calm is a reservoir of anger and unspoken superiority waiting for acknowledgement. And those unspoken currents will shape how he bonds, how he retreats, how he loves, and how he subtly manipulates without realizing it. If you notice yourself in any of this, hold that recognition gently. It is not a flaw, it is an origin. When you're ready, we'll explore what happens when this early blueprint enters adult relationships, where harmony becomes a strategy and the shadow begins to negotiate behind closed doors. When a man grows up mastering the art of keeping emotional storms at bay, he often enters adulthood with a carefully crafted facade. Not a false self in the theatrical sense, but a refined version of the boy who learned that harmony keeps relationships intact. He becomes the man others trust instantly, the one who listens deeply, responds thoughtfully, and makes space for everyone else's feelings. Strangers open up to him. Partners describe him as a rare kind of presence, and on the surface, this seems like the fulfillment of his childhood wish, to be valued for the sensitivity he once hid. But beneath this immaculate exterior lies a structure that few ever look at directly. He doesn't simply offer empathy, he mirrors. He reflects what others want to see, because mirroring was once the safest path through the world. And even though this looks like emotional intelligence, it often costs him something essential: honesty. Instead of saying what he feels, he shapes himself to what the moment requires. Instead of expressing discomfort, he absorbs it. Instead of disagreeing, he quiets the part of himself that holds the boundary. People call him patient, grounded, enlightened. Yet what they're encountering is not presence. It is self-erasure, polished into a virtue. Here is a destabilizing truth that tends to land heavily for men like this. What you call empathy may sometimes be fear-wearing gentleness as armor. When harmony becomes a priority, authenticity becomes a casualty. Over time, a strange relational pattern emerges. He is fully available until the moment someone needs something he cannot shape himself into. Then he disappears, not abruptly or cruelly, but quietly, pulling inward, withdrawing, losing warmth, becoming a silhouette of his former openness. People experience this as inconsistency, but for him, it feels like self-preservation. To say no or to express anger would risk the connection he worked so hard to protect. So he retreats instead, and even he may not fully understand why. Jung would say that the more a man identifies with his goodness, the more vigorously his shadow gathers behind him. Not as malice, but as unexpressed instinct, desire, ambition, anger, impulse. The traits he exiled in childhood do not disappear. They migrate to the unconscious and begin negotiating the relationship from behind the scenes. He may attract partners who embody the very qualities he represses and then resent them for living out what he cannot. He may feel morally superior to those who express conflict openly, all while avoiding confrontation himself. And he may believe he is the stable one, when in truth, he is simply the quiet one. At this stage, something subtle begins to unfold. His empathy, which others praise, becomes an instrument of control, not through intention, but through structure. A partner breaks down, and he becomes the emotional anchor. A friend spirals, and he becomes the advisor. A relationship falters, and he becomes the one who understands. This makes him indispensable, which feels safe. But being indispensable is not the same as being loved, and sometimes, without realizing it, he reinforces a dynamic where the other depends on his steadiness, not his truth. There are moments when he says, "I just want you to be okay." And beneath that surface-level compassion lies a quieter current. "If you rely on me, you will not leave me." The intention is not manipulative, yet the effect can be. Because if he were to stop rescuing, he would have to face what he actually wants, needs, and fears. He would have to face his anger, his boundaries, his desire for reciprocity. He would have to face the part of himself he has kept underwater for decades. Here is another reframing line that often creates stillness in the room. Sometimes the man who works hardest to create peace is the one most afraid of his own power. When this dynamic continues unchecked, small cracks begin to show. Irritation when unappreciated, even though he rarely states what he needs. Withdrawal as a test of loyalty, followed by disappointment when the other person does not pursue him correctly. Quiet superiority toward those who express boundaries bluntly, mixed with envy of their directness. These signals are not signs of failure. They are signs that the psyche is tired of maintaining a persona that no longer fits. Relationships become both a refuge and a mirror, revealing the parts of him he has long avoided. This is often the stage where he begins to feel misunderstood again, not because others cannot see him, but because he has not yet seen himself clearly. The very facade he worked so hard to perfect begins to feel restrictive. The mask becomes heavy, and the man who prided himself on being steady begins to feel internally divided. If any of this feels familiar, it is not a flaw. It is a pattern rooted in a very old promise. Be good, and you will be safe. But adult relationships are not upheld by goodness alone. They are upheld by honesty, boundaries, and mutual presence. And this is where the rare man begins to encounter the edges of his persona, when his longing for depth meets the truth that depth cannot be built upon harmony alone. As we move forward, we will enter the chapter where this structure meets its most intense challenge: chemistry. The kind of connection that does not feel safe, but alive. The kind that awakens childhood echoes. The kind that binds him not through compatibility, but through familiarity. And in that arena, the shadow does not stay quiet. There comes a moment in the life of a man shaped by vigilance when he meets someone who feels uncannily familiar. Not simply attractive, not simply exciting, but known, as though he has walked into a room he has never seen yet somehow remembers. Many men mistake this sensation for destiny, for soul recognition, for a rare alignment that transcends rational explanation. But in truth, what he is recognizing is not the other person. It is the echo of his earliest emotional environment, the warmth that comes and goes, the attention that sharpens and fades, the inconsistency that keeps him reaching forward even as part of him pulls back. These emotional rhythms feel like home not because they are healthy, but because they are familiar, and the nervous system confuses familiarity with safety. Jung once observed that the psyche is drawn to unresolved material with a magnetic intensity, and this is where that principle comes alive. The man does not fall for chaos. He falls for the pattern his body never learned to complete. For someone who grew up tuning himself to the moods of others, stability can feel strangely flat. Predictability can feel like emotional stillness, and stillness, for a nervous system conditioned by inconsistency, can feel like absence. So when he meets someone whose attention alternates between tenderness and withdrawal, whose presence oscillates between intimacy and distance, his body lights up, not with peace, but with purpose. Because here, his vigilance becomes useful again. Here he knows how to navigate. Here he knows how to matter. This is one of the most difficult truths for many men to acknowledge. Sometimes what feels profound is simply what feels familiar. Hidden beneath this connection is a biological loop that intensifies everything. Dopamine rises during anticipation. Oxytocin forms during the moments of closeness. Then, the emotional whiplash of inconsistency amplifies the entire cycle. The brain interprets the rise and crash as passion, meaning even fate, but it is often a reinforced pattern of reward unpredictability. This loop binds him not to the person, but to the rhythm. And because he is self-aware, he notices his suffering quickly. He becomes articulate about the dysfunction. He can name the pattern, analyze it, philosophize about it. Yet insight does not loosen the attachment. The loop continues because biology responds faster than psychology. He keeps returning, not out of weakness, but out of conditioning. What he calls chemistry may simply be a nervous system responding to a familiar pendulum, another reframing to hold gently. Some connections feel intense, not because they are right, but because they recreate the emotional landscape you were trained to survive. Within this dynamic, a role begins to awaken in him: the healer, the rescuer, the steady one who holds the emotional weight of the relationship. It is a role he knows well. When the partner becomes overwhelmed, he grounds the moment. When she spirals, he becomes the anchor. When conflict erupts, he becomes the calm center. And at first, this feels like purpose. It feels like contribution. It feels noble. But the shadow of this role carries a quiet turn. When his efforts go unacknowledged, irritation sharpens. When his stability is questioned, his tone hardens. When admiration fades, a subtle withdrawal emerges. Without intending to, he begins using silence to communicate disappointment. He uses composure as leverage. He uses intellect to reframe conflict in ways that place him back in the role of the reasonable one. This is not manipulation in the malicious sense. It is a structure learned long before language. There is a moment in many men's lives when they confront a sentence like this one. The gentleman becomes most dangerous when he cannot imagine himself capable of danger. Because danger is not always expressed through volume or anger. Sometimes it is expressed through withdrawal, avoidance, or moral superiority. Sometimes it is expressed through offering help that reinforces dependence. Sometimes it is expressed through being indispensable rather than vulnerable. And while he may never raise his voice, his absence speaks loudly. His restraint becomes a kind of pressure. His quiet knowing becomes its own form of control. These behaviors are not signs of cruelty. They are signs of a wounded template, trying to maintain order in a space where his old strategies no longer work cleanly. Eventually, the cycle becomes exhausting. Not because he wants to leave, but because the emotional rhythm keeps his nervous system in a constant state of anticipation. He begins to confuse panic with longing. He begins to crave the relief after conflict more than the person himself. He begins to equate emotional spikes with intimacy. And one day, he notices that silence from this person triggers dread rather than sadness, urgency rather than clarity. Here is a turning point. When the absence of someone feels like a threat instead of a loss, the bond is no longer about love. It is about survival. This is often the moment when he realizes the connection feels like destiny, only because his body is repeating an unfinished story. Yet even then, stepping away feels impossible. Because leaving chaos feels like betraying something ancient inside him. A part of him still believes that if he can just stabilize the relationship, he will finally stabilize the ghost of his childhood. Before this chapter closes, consider one optional reflection. If stability has ever felt dull to you, or if intensity has ever felt like proof of connection, it may not mean you are made for chaos. It may simply mean that your nervous system has never rested long enough to recognize peace. In the next chapter, we will explore what happens when this loop finally fractures, when the intellect awakens to its own role in the pattern, and when thinking itself becomes a way to avoid feeling the truth beneath the attachment. When the bond built on intensity finally begins to fracture, the man who has spent a lifetime relying on perception turns toward the one tool he trusts most, his mind. He does not collapse into numbness or rage. He ascends into analysis. He revisits every conversation, every shift in tone, every contradiction, reconstructing the story with precision. It feels responsible. It feels adult. It feels like clarity. But often, it is distance. Not clarity from the situation, but distance from his own body. In the aftermath of a chaotic connection, thinking becomes sanctuary. He turns to Jung, to philosophy, to typology, to metaphysics. He builds frameworks around the relationship, the trauma bond, the attachment style, the psychological pattern. Each idea adds another stone to the monastery he retreats into. He is not trying to avoid accountability. He is trying to survive the weight of what the relationship exposed in him. But there is a subtle danger in turning pain into theory. The moment he names the dynamic too quickly, he no longer has to feel it fully. The moment he intellectualizes the narrative, he can bypass the rawness of his own grief. This is where one of the most confronting realizations often appears. He may use brilliance to avoid introspection. Not the introspection of thought, but the introspection of sensation. The kind that lives in the chest, the throat, the belly. The kind that trembles rather than articulates. The kind that cannot be diagrammed. Shame often fuels this escape into abstraction. Shame for missing the signs. Shame for participating in the dynamic. Shame for losing himself again. And instead of sitting with the shame, he tries to outthink it. He expands the story until his role feels smaller. He spiritualizes the connection until his responsibility feels diffuse. He reframes the chaos as archetypal, so he doesn't have to admit where he abandoned his own boundaries. Neuroscience offers a grounded explanation for this. A childhood conditioned by threat primes the amygdala, the part of the brain that scans for danger. When emotional pain surfaces, the prefrontal cortex, the center of analysis, rushes in to manage the overwhelm. But overwhelm is not processed by analysis. It is processed by regulation. When a man turns exclusively toward thought, he is not being disciplined. He is dissociating. This is not a flaw. It is a strategy the nervous system developed before he had language. Thinking gave him the control he never felt. Understanding gave him the illusion of safety. But eventually, the gap between his thoughts and his body widens. He can explain everything, but feel nothing cleanly. Here is a reframing that shifts the ground under many men. Rationality is not the opposite of emotion. It is often emotion that has been exiled. In this space, the man becomes a scholar of his own suffering. He reads, writes, analyzes, debates. He gathers frameworks like armor. But the more knowledge he collects, the further he drifts from the very aliveness he is trying to regain. The monastery becomes a refuge from the world he longs to re-enter. He becomes the monk who memorizes every scripture on suffering, but never places his feet on the ground of his own sorrow. Philosophers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche warned that thinking used as escape collapses into nihilism, not clarity. When the intellect tries to carry pain alone, it eventually turns against itself. Depth becomes heaviness. Reflection becomes rumination. Meaning becomes abstraction. And the man begins to feel like he is dissolving into his own thoughts. This is the point where the persona fractures. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but inevitably. The facade of understanding can no longer contain what the body has been holding. The narratives fail to soothe. The frameworks fail to protect. And what rises from beneath is the part of him he has been footnoting his entire life. The part that wants to feel, not explain. As this breakdown approaches, the psyche begins preparing for its next confrontation. The moment when the mask finally fails, and the man meets the shadow he has been describing, but not embodying. There is a moment, often quiet, often unspectacular, when the rare man's carefully maintained structure can no longer support the weight of its own contradictions. It might come through a breakup, a confrontation, a sentence spoken in anger, or the slow erosion of a dynamic he thought he was holding together through patience. But whatever form it takes, the effect is the same. The mask fails. Not because he chooses to remove it, but because it starts to crumble under pressure. A familiar story emerges here. A composite drawn from countless men who carried the same blueprint. The man has been trying to stabilize a relationship, often with someone he believes he understands deeply. He has offered insight, support, reassurance. He has taken responsibility for the emotional climate, believing this is what strength looks like. Then one day, the person he has been trying to hold together steps away. Not quietly, but with words that pierce the narrative he has worked so hard to maintain. She tells him he was controlling. She tells him he was avoidant. She tells him he was manipulative in ways he did not recognize. His first response is outrage, not explosive, but wounded. He thinks of his sacrifices, of the patience he extended, of the storms he absorbed. How could the very traits he believed were noble be interpreted as harm? He revisits the messages, the conversations, the attempts at repair. At first, he searches for evidence that clears him. He wants the story to confirm what he believed about himself, that he was the stable one, the good one, the rare one. But weeks later, something shifts. Instead of searching for validation, he begins to actually see. He reads the same conversations again and notices what he missed before. The long explanations where empathy should have been. The way he instructed rather than expressed. The moments he pulled away to test whether he mattered. The ways he guided the emotional narrative without revealing his own truth. The patterns he mistook for love when they were attempts to avoid abandonment. It is not guilt that rises, but recognition. A deeper understanding that the shadow he studied in books was never theoretical. It was active. It was participating. It was influencing his choices, while he believed he was operating from clarity. Beneath the anger he felt toward her, he begins to sense another layer. The terror of becoming the very parent whose emotional absence shaped him. Her accusations did more than wound him. They revealed him. They tore open the story he had been rehearsing and exposed the unfiltered self underneath. This is the private trial, Jung called the withdrawal of projection. The moment when a man stops seeing others as the carriers of his disowned qualities and realizes those qualities were his from the beginning. His partners were not mysteries, they were mirrors. Each one reflected a different angle of the self he had been narrating around. The longing for harmony, the fear of conflict, the subtle maneuvers to avoid loss, all of it belonged to him, not to the people he chose. This is where another reframing emerges, one that feels both unsettling and liberating. The qualities you condemn in others often reveal the parts of yourself you have not yet allowed to breathe. The man begins sensing the patterns with more clarity. He sees how he leveraged depth to maintain distance, how he used emotional insight to shape outcomes, how he demanded understanding without offering transparency, how he moralized his restraint because he feared the chaos inside him. He realizes the shadow was not the enemy, the denial of it was. And as he sits with this recognition, something unexpected occurs. The nervous system, once tightened by vigilance, begins to soften. Neuroplasticity makes room for new possibilities. Circuits shaped by survival begin to reorganize, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through small moments of honesty. The simple act of naming what he feels, the willingness to tolerate discomfort without retreating, the courage to hold a boundary without explaining it, the decision to be present without managing the emotional landscape around him. What emerges here is not a new personality, but a reclaimed one. Adaptation was his first strength. Now it becomes his tool for integration. He understands that rarity was never about traits. It was about endurance, and that endurance can now be repurposed into something cleaner, something truer, something that does not depend on being indispensable or unseen. This chapter ends with a shift from story to possibility. Because once a man recognizes his shadow, he no longer fears it. He begins to see it as the missing half of his strength. And from this point forward, every choice he makes becomes an act of individuation, the gradual alignment of the man he shows the world with the man he actually is. By the time a man reaches this point in his journey, the idea of being rare begins to mean something entirely different from what he believed in the beginning. It no longer refers to his intuition, his sensitivity, or his emotional depth. Those traits, while valuable, were shaped long before he had a choice. What now distinguishes him is not what was formed in childhood, but what he chooses to confront in adulthood. He understands that rarity is not a mystical identity. It is a responsibility. The man who once felt like a carved relic in a construction site begins to notice that the world has not changed, but his relationship to it has. He no longer sees his early adaptations as signs of destiny. He sees them as survival patterns that once protected him and now limit him. He sees how his capacity for empathy carried the weight of unspoken fear. He sees how his emotional attunement was built from vigilance, not abundance. He sees how his longing for harmony kept his anger underground. And seeing these truths does not diminish him. It grounds him. There is a moment when he recognizes that his depth was never the full picture. Beneath it lived a warrior he never allowed to speak, a force he misinterpreted as danger rather than strength. And now, instead of exiling that force, he begins to integrate it, not through aggression or grand gestures, but through presence, through boundaries that do not require explanation, through honesty that does not depend on perfect timing, through a quiet willingness to be seen without curating the impression he leaves. This is where the earlier chapters begin to converge. The child who predicted storms, the young man who retreated into inner worlds, the adult who mirrored instead of revealing, the lover who mistook intensity for intimacy, the thinker who built monasteries from abstraction. All of them return now, not as flaws, but as clues, pieces of a blueprint that was never meant to be permanent, pieces that make sense only when held with compassion. Here is a reframing that marks the threshold of adulthood in its truest sense. The rarest men are not the ones who feel deeply. They are the ones who take responsibility for the shadows their depth once concealed. And responsibility here does not mean self-blame. It means awareness. It means choosing to meet the world without hiding behind mystique. It means recognizing that power is not the opposite of gentleness. It is gentleness supported by an honest center. Jung called this individuation, the ongoing process of weaving together the parts of yourself you once split apart in order to survive. Neuroplasticity reminds us that nothing is fixed, not temperament, not instinct, not emotional patterns carved decades ago. The same nervous system that adapted to unpredictability can learn safety. The same mind that turned pain into theory can learn to feel without collapsing. The same heart that gravitated toward chaos can learn to rest without losing its spark. Adaptation was the first story, integration becomes the second. As this video closes, consider how the entire arc reframes the idea of rarity, not as trauma dressed in poetry, not as loneliness worn as identity, not as superiority masked as depth, but as accountability in the dark when no one is watching. As the courage to meet yourself without ornament, as the willingness to refine the part of you that could ruin what you love if left unexamined. If something in this journey traced your inner architecture, one line is enough to mark it, not for validation, but as a signal, so another man watching knows he is not the only one navigating this landscape. When you feel ready, I will continue with whatever you need next.